Over the course of a single year in one well-to-do family in a quiet corner of Croydon, three people sat down to ordinary meals: a bowl of soup, a glass of medicine, a supper after a fishing holiday, and then died one after another in terrible pain. And three times a doctor looked at the body, reached for a death certificate, and wrote down something gentle, something natural: a weak heart, a bad stomach. Nobody connected them. The poison was hiding in the most ordinary place. There is the family dinner table, and it very nearly stayed hidden forever. The only reason anyone ever learned the truth is that eventually somebody refused to let the dead stay buried. The first to die was a man named Edmund Duff. It was the spring of 1928. Edmund was 59, well-liked, a former colonial civil servant, and by every account in decent health when he set off for a few days fishing in the country. He came home on a Thursday, sat down to supper that evening, and within hours he was violently, frighteningly ill. Nausea cramping that seized his legs, vomiting, and diarrhea that went on through the night. By the following morning, Edmund Duff was dead. The doctor who attended him, a man named Binning, was genuinely baffled. The collapse had been so sudden and so brutal that he said aloud, "What everyone must have been thinking, this looked like it could be poison." And that is the first place this story could have turned and didn't. An inquest was opened. An official even came to the house and asked Edmund's widow whether there was any poison on the premises. She took him down to the cellar and showed him a tin of liquid weed killer, and he calmly removed a sample to be tested. The murder weapon, in other words, was handed to an investigator in the very first days of the case. And still, when the inquest resumed weeks later, the pathologist stood up and delivered a tidy, reassuring verdict. The body, he said, was free of poison. What had killed Edmund Duff was a heart attack, very likely brought on by a touch of sunstroke out on the water. One could, he told the court, quite exclude poisoning, death by natural causes. Edmund was buried, mourned, and the file was closed. Sit with that, because it is the whole engine of this case. A healthy man drops dead overnight, in agony. His own doctor says the word poison. The very weed killer that did it is sampled from his cellar. And the system looks at all of it and rules formally and finally that nothing was done to him at all. That is the first lie. And it held for almost a year. To understand how it held you, need the family. The Sidneys were a comfortable, respectable South Croydon clan, the sort whose homes sat within a few streets of one another, and whose lives were knitted together by Sunday lunches and shared inheritances. Edmund's widow was Grace Clever Charming, striking the granddaughter of a man who had once been Lord Mayor of London, and a woman who had married Edmund years before, against her family's wishes, because they thought him beneath her. Around Grace stood the rest of them: her brother Tom Sidney, her mother Violet, the family matriarch, and her unmarried sister Vera, who lived with Violet. Hold those three names: Tom, Violet, Vera. Within a year, two of them would be dead, the same way Edmund was, and Grace would be standing at the center of every single death. The next to go was Vera. She was around 40, unmarried, and until that winter entirely well. Early in 1929, she began inexplicably to sicken. Then on the 13th of February, the family gathered for lunch. An aunt had been invited, and Vera was struck down exactly as Edmund had been, the same sudden savage assault on the stomach, the same vomiting, the same agony. She lingered a day and died. When investigators finally went looking, they found arsenic and traced it to the soup served at that lunch. And here is the detail that tells you how cold and how careful this killer was. Vera was not the only one who ate the soup. Her mother had some. The cook had some. Even the household cat, by one account, had a share. They were all fine. Only Vera, the intended one, died. Somehow the poison had reached a single bowl at a crowded table, which means it was never in the pot. It was meant for her and her alone. And then barely 2.5 weeks later, on the 5th of March, it was Violet's turn, Vera's mother, Grace's mother, the matriarch of the whole family. She fell ill within hours of her lunch and was dead by that evening. This time the arsenic was not in the soup, but in her medicine slipped into the very thing an ailing old woman swallowed to feel better. 3 people now, one small close family, all dead inside a single year, all in the same grotesque, convulsing way. And only with this third death did the thing everyone had been carefully not seeing become impossible to ignore. You can sign one sudden death away as a weak heart. You cannot do it 3 times to the same family and keep a straight face. A single death is a tragedy a coroner can close. A pattern is the one thing he cannot quietly file under natural causes. Public suspicion boiled over, the newspapers seized on it, and the case became a national sensation. And at last, the authorities did what they should have done a year before. They began to dig. In late March of 1929, the bodies of Vera and Violet were exhumed. And then in May, the men with shovels went back to the cemetery a second time. For Edmund, the man who had already been in the ground for over a year, the man officially at peace, the man whose death had been signed, sealed, mourned, and closed as perfectly natural. They examined what was left of all 3, and they found arsenic in every one of them, including Edmund, including the death an expert had stood up in court and sworn was free of poison. This is the moment the whole case turns on, so let it land. The very first death, the one the system had been most certain about, the one it had affirmatively cleared, was a murder all along. And if Vera and Violet had simply lived, no one would ever have known. Edmund Duff's killing would have stayed exactly what the paper said: a weak heart, a little son, a sad and ordinary end. The only reason it was ever uncovered is that the poisoner could not stop at one. Now reason it through the way the investigators finally had to. This was not a run of bad luck, and it was not a sickly family. When police searched the household, they found exactly what the bodies pointed to: tins of old-fashioned liquid weed killer, thick with arsenic in the form of sodium arsenite, the same poison in the same kind of tin a widow had once shown an official and watched him sample and walk away. And look at how it was delivered. Not in a dark alley, not by a stranger. It went into a bowl of soup at a family lunch, and into a dose of an old woman's medicine. Whoever did this didn't force a lock or climb a wall. They had a chair at the table and access to the medicine shelf. They could move through these 3 lives without raising a single alarm, because they belonged to them. The arsenic came from inside the family, carried by a hand all 3 victims trusted completely. That is the whole reason it worked. So who held that hand? The suspicion then, and for the better part of a century since, has settled most heavily on one person, Grace. She had been close to every victim. She moved freely through every household. She was, by the accounts of the police, who pored over the files, the one figure who connected all three deaths. And there were motives if you went looking. There were whispers of an affair of a woman grown tired of a husband she had married against her family's advice. There was money. Edmund carried a life insurance policy worth, in today's terms, something like £80,000. And after he died, there was little else, for he had spent freely in life. And when a mother and a sister died, there were inheritances to be gathered. To the detectives who studied her, Grace began to look like the single answer to all three. And yet she was never charged, not once, because suspicion is not evidence, and the case against her never climbed above the circumstantial. Her brother Tom drew suspicion too. He stood to inherit as well, and not long after the deaths, he left England for America, which did nothing to quiet the talk. But there was no hard proof against him either. And this is the wall. The case has never gotten past the very wall. The crime writer Agatha Christie identified when she studied it at the time. You can construct a motive to kill Edmund. You can construct a different one to kill Vera. You can construct a third for Violet. What you cannot do is find a single motive held by a single person that cleanly accounts for all three deaths at once. Every promising road Christie wrote runs into a blind alley. It was, she said, essentially a family drama, and the family kept it secret. The inquest formally concluded that at least two of the three had been murdered with arsenic. And then in 1929, the case was quietly closed unsolved, and it has stayed unsolved for nearly 100 years. No arrest, no trial, no answer. But notice where the true horror of this one lives. It is not only that a poisoner walked free, it is that Edmund Duff's murder spent an entire year as a solved and settled and comfortable thing, a natural death. A closed file, a grieving widow, a grave no one ever meant to open again. The killer's most powerful ally was never a clever alibi or an absence of clues. It was a system that took one look at a murdered man with the word poison already spoken, and the poison itself already in its hands, and decided on the record that no crime had occurred. The most dangerous lie in this whole story was never who did it. For a year it was that nobody had done anything at all. The houses on those quiet Croydon streets are mostly gone now, replaced by blocks of flats. The Sydneys are long dead, and the suspicion is buried with them. But somewhere in that close, comfortable family, almost certainly, sat a person who fed arsenic to the people who loved and trusted them, stood at three gravesides, and was never once made to answer for it. 3 ordinary meals, 3 gentle words on 3 certificates, and a truth that surfaced at all only because this time the dead refused to stay buried. It would be easy to write Croydon off as a relic, the bad luck of a slower century, when the science was crude and a sleepy investigation could let a poisoner slip away. So let me bring you forward 80 years to a modern American city where the forensic science was sophisticated, the medical examiner was an expert, and everyone, the police, the coroner, the courts, looked hard at the body. And the official answer may still be wrong, because this next lie was not told by a missing investigation. It was stamped with full authority by the very office whose entire job is to tell the truth about how a person died. On the night of a January blizzard in 2011, a 27-year-old schoolteacher was found dead on her own kitchen floor, a knife buried in her chest, a half-finished fruit salad still on the counter beside her. She had been stabbed more than 20 times. The chest, the abdomen, the head, and around 10 times in the back of her own neck. Then the city of Philadelphia studied those wounds and reached a conclusion her parents have spent the last 14 years trying to undo. They ruled that she did it to herself. Her name was Ellen Greenberg. She was 27, a first-grade teacher, recently engaged to be married and close to her parents. On January the 26th, 2011, as a heavy snowstorm bore down on Philadelphia, she was home in the Manayunk apartment she shared with her fiancé. She had left school early because of the weather. Sometime that afternoon in that apartment, she died. By the accounts of those who knew her, Ellen was a warm, devoted teacher and an only child unusually close to her mother and father. In the weeks before she died, she had seemed anxious. She had started new medication and had left work early more than once. The medical examiner's office would later treat that anxiety as part of the case for suicide. Her family saw something else, a young woman under stress who was by every plan she was making moving toward her wedding and her life not away from it. The account of how she was found sits at the center of everything, so here it is plainly. Her fiancé said that he had gone down to the building's gym, and that when he came back up, the apartment door was latched from the inside by a swing bar lock he could not open from the hallway. He said he forced the door, went in, and found Ellen on the kitchen floor, slumped against the cabinets. He called 911 at around 6:30 in the evening. What the responders found was staggering. Ellen had been stabbed roughly 20 times, a number later revised upward to 23 across her chest, her abdomen, her scalp, and the back of her neck. A 10-inch kitchen knife was still buried in her chest. There were bruises on her arms and torso. And on the counter sat that half-finished fruit salad, the small, ordinary debris of a perfectly ordinary afternoon frozen mid-task. In those first hours, the apartment was not even treated as a crime scene. Now I want to isolate one fact because everything in this case orbits it. Of those wounds, roughly 10 were to the back of Ellen's own neck and the back of her head. Stop and picture what that would take driving a knife into the back of your own neck over and over after already stabbing yourself a dozen times elsewhere. Hold that image. Because the city of Philadelphia looked at it and concluded that this is exactly what happened. And it did not arrive at that conclusion in a straight line, which is the part that puts this case squarely inside our story. The first official ruling by the medical examiner who performed the autopsy, a doctor named Marlon Osborne, was homicide. Murder. That was what the body first told him. Then the police pushed back. Detectives reported they could find no evidence of an intruder. The door, after all, had been latched from inside. And in the weeks that followed, in the spring of 2011, Osborne reversed himself. Homicide became suicide. The same body, the same wounds, the same knife reclassified without any public explanation that ever satisfied the people who loved her, from something done to Ellen into something she had done to herself. And compounding all of it was the scene itself. By the time the apartment was given a full forensic examination, it had reportedly already been cleaned the site of a possible homicide, tidied before it could ever be properly read. A ruling that should have followed the evidence appeared to her family to have followed the pushback instead. So reason through what the suicide ruling is being asked to carry. It has to account for 10 wounds to the back of Ellen's own neck and head. It has to account for a finding that flipped from murder to suicide, not because new evidence appeared, but after police said they doubted an intruder had been there. It has to sit beside a scene reportedly cleaned before it was fully processed. And it has to answer the forensic specialists who later reviewed the case for her family and reached the opposite conclusion. One argued that at least one wound had pierced Ellen's spinal cord, an injury that would have left her physically unable to keep stabbing herself. They pointed to the absence of the hesitation wounds that so often mark a true suicide, to wounds driven through to the back of the skull at angles nearly impossible to reach on oneself, and to injuries that had bled very little as though inflicted after death. None of that on its own proves murder. But all of it is exactly the set of questions a homicide investigation exists to resolve. And the suicide ruling did not resolve them. It closed them. Take the locked door because it is the hinge the whole suicide ruling swings on. The apartment was latched from inside, and to investigators that meant no one could have come or gone, so they reasoned no intruder and therefore no murder. But notice the leap in that. A latched door can tell you something about how a person might have left. It cannot by itself explain 10 knife wounds to the back of a woman's own neck. The door answered a question about access, and was then used to settle a question about wounds it could not speak to at all. And here is the quiet trap, the ruling set for everyone who came after. Because the death was classified, a suicide, there was no homicide investigation, and with no homicide investigation, the scene was released, and cleaned evidence went ungathered, and the trail went cold within days. Which means that today one of the strongest arguments for keeping the suicide ruling is that there is no longer enough evidence to prove anything else. The ruling helped erase the very proof that might have overturned it. It protects itself. Here I have to give you the other side squarely because the honest truth about this case is that it is genuinely unresolved. The medical examiner's office has not backed down. As recently as 2025, after re-examining the case, the city's chief medical examiner issued a long, detailed report reaffirming the finding of suicide and recounting the wounds at 23. The office has noted that the only DNA on the knife was Ellen's own, and Ellen's documented anxiety and recent change in medication remain part of the official case for suicide. So let me be precise about what I am and am not saying. I am not telling you Ellen Greenberg was murdered. No one has ever been charged in this case, and I am accusing no one because there is no one to accuse. There is only a ruling and a long, bitter, unresolved fight over whether that ruling is right. That fight has been carried for 14 years by two people above all Ellen's parents, Josh and Sandy Greenberg. They never accepted the word on their daughter's death certificate, and they have refused to let it rest. They built a petition that gathered well over 100,000 signatures. They brought in their own forensic pathologists to re-examine the evidence. They sued first the medical examiner's office and its officials, then the city in a wider case, and eventually reached a settlement with the city worth $650,000. And they pushed the manner of death question all the way up to Pennsylvania's highest court, which agreed to weigh in. But across all of it, no charge was ever brought against anyone, and a suicide on the books is not a case a prosecutor takes to trial. The label did not just describe the outcome, it quietly decided it. And in the strangest turn of all, Marlon Osborne, the very pathologist who had changed the ruling to suicide, later signed a sworn statement saying the manner of death should be classified as something other than suicide. The man who wrote the word said under oath that the word was wrong. And still, after yet another official review, it stands. This is where Ellen Greenberg's case becomes its own particular kind of nightmare, different from the one before it. In Croydon, the horror was that nobody looked a murder slip past as a natural death, because no one was paying attention. Here, everyone looked. There was an autopsy, an investigation, a medical examiner, the police, the courts, the press, 14 years of relentless scrutiny. And the official answer may still be wrong. This lie, if it is one, is not hidden in a grave waiting to be dug up. It is printed in the public record, reaffirmed on review, and defended by the institution that wrote it. At Croydon, the truth was buried in the ground. Here, the conclusion itself is the thing standing in the way, and a family has spent 14 years trying to change a single word. Ellen Greenberg was 27. She taught small children to read. She was planning a wedding. As of the making of this video, her death certificate still says suicide. The case remains officially closed and unresolved, and her parents are still fighting to reopen it. They are not asking the world to name a killer. They are asking only for the thing Croydon never got, either for someone finally to admit that the gentle official word for what happened may not be the true one. Johnson here, quick break before the last one, because it's the case that changes the scale of everything we've just seen. If these are landing for you, subscribing and tapping the bell genuinely helps them get made. And if there's a case you want me to dig into, drop it in the comments. All right, the last one. So far, both of our lies have been about a single death. One body, one certificate, one wrong word. In Croydon, no one looked hard enough. With Ellen Greenberg, everyone looked, and the answer may still be wrong. But in both, the failure was contained to one case. The last story asks something larger and far more frightening. What happens when the mislabeling isn't one mistaken ruling, but the entire system we use to certify death itself? When the man calmly writing natural causes over and over for 25 years is the murderer himself. For more than 20 years, the people of Hyde in the north of England had the kind of family doctor you hope for. Patient, old-fashioned, always willing to make a house call, especially to the elderly women who trusted him most. And for more than 20 years, those women kept dying, quietly, at home, often within hours of his visit. Every certificate said the same gentle thing, natural causes. Nobody saw it because there was nothing to see, just an old town losing its old people the way old towns do. The first two people on earth to sense something was wrong weren't detectives. They were an undertaker and a doctor who had started counting forms. His name was Harold Shipman, and on paper he was the best kind of doctor a town could ask for. He worked long hours. He took patients others wouldn't. He remembered names, made house calls without being asked, and was especially attentive to the elderly, the widows living alone, The women in their 70s and 80s who looked forward to his visits as the warm point of a quiet day. They adored him. In a profession people are taught to trust. On sight, Dr. Shipman was the most trusted man in Hyde. That trust was not incidental to what he did. It was the whole instrument. There had been a warning decades earlier that everyone had long since moved past. In the 1970s, as a young doctor in a Yorkshire town, Shipman had become addicted to a powerful painkiller and was caught forging prescriptions to feed the habit. He was convicted, fined, sent for treatment, and then, after a pause, quietly allowed to go back to being a doctor. The inquiry that later examined his crimes came to suspect his killing may have begun around that very era. The system had glimpsed something wrong in him once before, dealt with it gently, and handed him back his patients. Because here is what Shipman was actually doing on those house calls. He was killing them. He would visit an elderly patient, usually alone, and inject her with a massive lethal dose of diamorphine medical-grade heroin that stopped her breathing within minutes. There was no struggle and no mess. An old woman dead in her own armchair in her own home slipped away as if in sleep shortly after a visit from her own caring doctor. The most unremarkable thing in the world. And then Shipman did the part that let him do it again and again for years. He would alter the patient's medical records quietly, backdating notes, inventing symptoms, building a paper history of decline that had never happened, so that if anyone ever did glance at the file, it would already tell the story of an old, ill woman who had simply reached her end. And then he signed the death certificate himself, cause of death, natural causes, in his own hand. That is the mechanism this whole case turns on, so understand what it means. In the system as it stood, the doctor who treated you was very often the same doctor who certified how you died. There was no one standing between Shipman and the paperwork. He was the killer, the only witness, and the official who ruled it wasn't a crime all at once. The question every safeguard is supposed to answer is who checks the doctor. And the answer for the longest time was that no one did. That is almost no one. Remember the two people from the start, the undertaker and the doctor, counting forms. In March of 1998, an undertaker in Hyde named Deborah Massey noticed something that unsettled her. Too many of Dr. Shipman's patients were dying, and they were dying the same way often found sitting up dressed as if death had come for them suddenly in the middle of an ordinary day, not slowly in a sick bed. She took her unease to another local doctor, Linda Reynolds, who had been noticing the same thing from her own angle, the sheer number of cremation forms she was being asked to countersign for Shipman's dead. Reynolds did exactly what she was supposed to do. She went to the coroner, John Pollard, and said, in effect, that the death rate around one doctor's practice did not look natural, and the system handed a clear warning by a careful, courageous person failed. The police were brought in, but the officers assigned were inexperienced. The inquiry was shallow, and after a quiet look at Shipman's tidied, falsified records, they concluded there was nothing there. The investigation was dropped in April of 1998, and in the weeks between that decision and the day he was finally caught, Harold Shipman killed at least 3 more people. The warning had been right. The system had been handed the truth, and it gave the truth back. So what undid a man who had murdered by then for over 2 decades, certifying every death with his own pen, not medicine, not the police, a single piece of paper, and his own greed. In June of 1998, one of his patients died, Kathleen Grundy, 81 years old, a former mayor of Hyde, energetic, sharp, and active in her community. She was found dead at home not long after a visit from Dr. Shipman, who of course put it down to old age. It would have been one more natural death in a long, invisible line, except that this time a will appeared. A crudely typed document surfaced claiming to be Kathleen Grundy's will and leaving almost her entire estate, around £386,000, not to her family but to her doctor, to Harold Shipman. And here the man's luck finally ran out, because Kathleen Grundy's daughter was a woman named Angela Woodruff, and Angela Woodruff was a solicitor. She knew her mother. She knew the will was a clumsy forgery, and she knew it almost at a glance. It had been typed on a machine that traced back to Shipman himself, and it carried his fingerprints. The meticulous forger of 1,000 medical records had thrown together the one document that truly mattered with almost contemptuous carelessness. She went to the police, and this time there was something solid to pull on. Kathleen Grundy's body was exhumed, and her tissues were tested, and they were full of a fatal dose of dimorphine. Sit with the shape of that. The man who had certified the deaths of hundreds of people away into nothing, who had made murder after murder disappear behind his own signature, was undone by the one document. He could not sign himself. He could write natural causes on a death certificate all day long. What he could not do was forge a dead woman's will past her solicitor daughter. Once police stopped trusting the certificates and started actually looking, the invisible turned monstrous. They reopened the deaths of Shipman's patients, exhumed bodies, pulled records. A local taxi driver named John Shaw came forward to say he had driven Shipman's elderly patients for years, and that he had counted with mounting horror around 21 of them who had died. This is the terrible genius of what Shipman did and why it lasted so long. Each death taken alone was completely ordinary, an old person at home signed off by a respected doctor. There was no pattern, because a pattern requires someone to add the deaths together, and the one man positioned to add them up was the very man certifying them as natural. The murders were hidden, not in shadows, but in plain sight, inside the most routine paperwork in all of medicine. You could only see the monster once you stopped believing the signatures. In January of 2000, Harold Shipman was convicted of 15 murders, 15 women killed between 1995 and 1998, and of forging Kathleen Grundy's will. He was given 15 life sentences and told he would never be released. Through the months of his trial at Preston Crown Court, Shipman never broke. He denied everything, insisting the records were genuine and the deaths natural, and showed not a flicker of remorse to the families who filled the gallery. He would go to his grave having admitted to nothing. But 15 was only what could be proven in a courtroom. A public inquiry led by Dame Janet Smith went back through more than 800 deaths across his entire career and reached a far darker conclusion that Shipman had murdered at least 215 people, and very possibly around 250 over the span of his medical life. He never confessed to a single one. In January of 2004, in his prison cell on the eve of his 58th birthday, He hanged himself, carrying the true and total count of what he had done out of reach forever. And this may be the most disturbing thing the inquiry uncovered. For almost all of those deaths, there was no ordinary motive at all. He did not kill for money. The forged will was the rare fatal exception. There was no robbery, no inheritance, no grudge to trace from victim to victim. He appears to have killed simply because he could. Because in those quiet front rooms, he held absolute power over whether a trusting old woman lived or died, and he used it again and again for 25 years, which means there was no money trail to follow and no motive to chase. The only thing that could ever have caught him was the system noticing its own numbers, and the system had been built to trust him instead. So look at where these three stories have brought us. In Croydon, one murder slipped by because no one was looking. In Philadelphia, one death may have been mislabeled, even though everyone was looking. And here in Hyde, the lie was not one missed death or one disputed ruling. The lie was the entire machine. Shipman did not outwit a brilliant detective. He exploited a system that trusted a doctor's signature so completely that one man could kill for a quarter of a century and have every single victim filed in his own neat handwriting under natural causes. He never needed to hide the bodies. The system hid them for him one certificate at a time. And that is the most dangerous lie of them all. Not who did it, but a structure so willing to call murder something gentle and ordinary that it hands the killer the pen and asks him to fill in the cause of death himself. The women Harold Shipman killed were not the natural arithmetic of old age. They were Kathleen Grundy and hundreds like her mothers and widows and pillars of a small town murdered in their own homes and then signed quietly out of existence as though nothing at all had happened. It took the forging of one will to prove that something had. A long public inquiry then pulled the whole system apart. And in the years afterward, Britain changed the way deaths are certified and cremations approved so that no single doctor could ever again be the only person who decides that the patient he treated died of natural causes. It is a small bureaucratic safeguard. It exists because for 25 years, the most dangerous thing in the town of Hyde was a kind word, a house call, and a signature that nobody thought to question. So, a poisoned family in Croydon, a young teacher in Philadelphia, a town full of trusting old women in Hyde, 3 sets of deaths in 3 different worlds, and in every one of them the same quiet thing went wrong before anything else did. In each case before there was ever a question of who, there was a piece of paper that said in effect that nothing had happened here. A weak heart, a suicide, natural causes. 3 gentle official words, and behind each one a murder the gentle word was hiding. That is the lie this whole story has been about. Not the dramatic one, not the hooded stranger or the criminal mastermind, but the bureaucratic one, the lie that lives on a form. Because a killer who is never even looked for does not need to be clever. The system does the hiding for him and files it under a natural death. Edmund Vera and Violet Sidney, Ellen Greenberg, Kathleen Grundy, and the hundreds whose names we will never fully know. The most dangerous lie was never who did it. For a year, for 14 years, for a quarter of a century, it was that nobody had done anything at all. I'm Johnson. Thanks for sitting with the hard ones. I'll see you on the next.